Welcome to this Q&A session for the WGU Human Growth and Development exam. These are real exam-style questions. We don't just reveal the answer, we break down the reasoning and theory behind each one. This video covers Domain 1. Foundations of lifespan development, including principles of the lifespan perspective, domains and periods of development, nature, nurture, and the enduring issues, the major developmental theorists, memory and conditioning. Don't forget, our website offers free study guides and practice questions designed to help you pass your D202 exam. You'll find the link right in the description below, so be sure to check it out and grab the resources you need to start studying smarter, not harder today. Alright, let's dive in. Question 1. A 72-year-old woman signs up for her first painting class, improves steadily across the term, and tells the instructor that picking up new skills keeps her mind active. A developmental psychologist points to her as evidence that meaningful change remains possible late in life. Which feature of the lifespan perspective does this scenario most clearly illustrate? Your options are: A. Development is one-dimensional and concludes once physical maturity is reached. B. Development after early adulthood consists only of steady, irreversible decline. C. Development is lifelong and plastic, so the capacity for change continues into old age. D. Development is fixed by heredity at conception and cannot be reshaped by experience. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is C. Development is lifelong and plastic, so the capacity for change continues into old age. C is correct because the lifespan perspective holds that development is lifelong and plastic, meaning people keep changing and can still be shaped by experience at any age. An older adult acquiring a genuine new skill is a textbook demonstration that growth does not stop at adulthood. A is wrong because the lifespan view is explicitly multidimensional, not one-dimensional, and it rejects the idea that development ends at maturity. Calling it one-dimensional and finished contradicts the very perspective the scenario illustrates. B is wrong because treating later life as nothing but decline ignores the multidirectional principle that gains and losses occur together. The woman is clearly gaining a skill, which is the opposite of pure decline. D is wrong because the plasticity principle says experience can reshape development, so heredity does not lock outcomes at conception. A learned painting skill is an environmental gain, not a fixed genetic trait. Human development doesn't stop once we reach adulthood. The lifespan perspective says every stage of life, even old age, brings its own growth, its own loss, and its own capacity for change. Researchers built this view on 5 principles. Development is lifelong, multidimensional across body, mind, and social self, multidirectional, plastic, and contextual, shaped by the history, culture, and family surrounding a person. Neuroplasticity is the biological engine behind lifelong learning. When an older adult practices a new skill, like learning an instrument, the brain physically builds new connections and reorganizes existing pathways, proving real change is still possible decades later. The clearest proof of multidirectionality is intelligence. Fluid intelligence, the speed to solve unfamiliar problems, peaks early and slowly declines, while crystallized intelligence, our accumulated knowledge and vocabulary, keeps climbing for decades, both true in the very same person. Finally, don't confuse growth with development. Growth is the quantitative change a scale or tape measure can capture, but development is broader, covering the qualitative reorganizations in how a person thinks, feels, and relates that no ruler can record. Question 2. An infant develops a strong emotional bond with her primary caregiver and protests loudly whenever he leaves the room. A student is asked to sort this attachment milestone into one of the 3 domains of development. Into which domain does forming an attachment fall? Your options are A. Psychosocial, because it involves emotion and relationships. B. Cognitive, because it centers on memory and problem solving. C. Physical, because it depends on the body and brain. D. Biosocial, because it reflects motor coordination. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Psychosocial, because it involves emotion and relationships. A is correct because attachment is an emotional bond and a relationship, which places it squarely in the psychosocial domain, also called the socio-emotional domain. That domain covers emotions, temperament, relationships, identity, and morality. B is wrong because the cognitive domain covers thinking, memory, attention, and language, not the emotional bond itself. Although memory helps the infant recognize the caregiver, the milestone being classified is the relationship, which is psychosocial. C is wrong because the physical domain covers body size, the brain, motor skills, and the senses. Attachment is not a bodily or motor milestone, even though it unfolds alongside physical growth. D is wrong because biosocial is simply another name for the physical domain, covering bodily and motor development. An emotional tie does not belong there. Developmental science organizes every human change into three domains: physical, cognitive, and psychosocial, and knowing which is the key to acing classification questions. Physical is the body and brain. Cognitive is thinking and memory. And psychosocial is feelings, relationships, and identity. A single keyword unlocks almost every classification question. Take myelination, the fatty sheath that coats nerve fibers in the brain. Because it's fundamentally a brain event, it's classified as physical, even though it affects how fast we think. 2 milestones trip students up. Attachment looks physical because of all the feeding and holding, but it's psychosocial since at its core it's an emotional bond. Language looks social, but it's cognitive because it's fundamentally about symbols and mental processing. Remember the split. Physical is what the body does. Cognitive is what the mind does with information. And psychosocial is what the heart does in connection with others. Question 3. A 20-year-old has finished high school but has not settled into a stable career, a committed partnership, or an independent household. He describes these years as a stretch of exploring options and frequent change. According to the periods of development used in the course, which period is he in? Your options are A. Adolescence, B. Early adulthood, C. Late adulthood, D. Emerging adulthood. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is D. Emerging adulthood. D is correct because emerging adulthood spans roughly 18 to 25 and is defined by exploration and instability. Exactly the pattern described. Annette identified this stretch as a distinct period between adolescence and settled early adulthood. A is wrong because adolescence runs from the onset of puberty to about 18 and centers on puberty and identity formation. At 20 and out of high school, he has already moved past adolescence. B is wrong because early adulthood, roughly 25 to 40, is marked by settling into intimacy, career, and family. The scenario stresses that he has not yet settled, which fits the earlier emerging adulthood phase. C is wrong because late adulthood begins around 65 and involves retirement and life review. A 20-year-old is decades away from this period. Developmental science divides the human lifespan into an ordered sequence of periods, each with its own characteristic task and age range. These periods aren't rigid birthdays. They're flexible chapters that help us place a person on the developmental map. The sequence runs from the prenatal period through infancy, early and middle childhood, adolescence, emerging adulthood, early adulthood, middle adulthood, and finally late adulthood. Each stage carries its own developmental headlines, from first words in infancy to life review in late adulthood. Each period has signal words worth memorizing. Fastest growth and first words point to infancy. Puberty and identity point to adolescence. Exploring options and instability point to emerging adulthood. Career, marriage, and family point to early adulthood. Guiding the next generation signals middle adulthood, while retirement and life review signal late adulthood. The boundary examiners test most is between emerging and early adulthood. Annette argued emerging adulthood, roughly ages 18 to 25, is defined by open exploration and instability. Early adulthood, by contrast, is defined by settled commitment. The same age can fall in either period depending on which description fits the life. Question 4. A pediatric nurse explains to new parents that their infant gained control of his shoulders and upper arms before he could pick up small objects with his finger and thumb. Which principle of physical growth does this head-to-fingertip sequence illustrate? Your options are A. Cephalocaudal development, B. Proximodistal development, C. Distal proximal development, D. Lateralization. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. Proximodistal development. B is correct because proximodistal growth proceeds from the midline of the body outward, so control of the torso and arms develops before control of the hands and fingers. An infant mastering the shoulders and arms before fine finger control is the defining example. A is wrong because cephalocaudal growth proceeds from the head downward, explaining why head control precedes walking. It describes a top-to-bottom sequence, not the center-to-extremities sequence in the scenario. C is wrong because distal proximal growth, in which the extremities develop first, describes the reverse pattern seen during the adolescent growth spurt, not infancy. The infant here follows the typical center-outward order. D is wrong because lateralization refers to the specialization of the brain's two hemispheres, not the direction of motor growth. It does not describe arm before finger control. Development follows two predictable directions. One runs from head to tail, the other from the body center out to the fingertips. Cephalocaudal growth moves from the head toward the feet, so babies control their heads before they sit, stand, or walk. Proximodistal growth moves from the trunk outward, so infants command their arms before they master a fine finger grip. Picture control descending like a tide from the head downward, while a second current radiates outward from the spine to the fingertips. These two axes together explain the entire order of early motor milestones. Exam scenarios test whether you can match the sequence to the right term. Head control before walking signals cephalocaudal, arm control before finger control signals proximodistal, and big feet or hands on a still growing teen signals the distal to proximal reversal of puberty. Remember, cephalocaudal and proximodistal describe the orderly early march of growth, one vertical and one horizontal, while the distal to proximal pattern is the special reversal that appears only during the adolescent growth spurt. Question 5. A 68-year-old scores lower than she did at 30 on a timed test of solving unfamiliar logic puzzles, yet her vocabulary and accumulated knowledge are richer than ever. A researcher cites her results to argue that development does not move in a single direction. This simultaneous gain and loss best illustrates that development is. Your options are A. Unidimensional, B. Discontinuous, C. Multidirectional, D. Fixed and stable. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is C. Multidirectional. C is correct because multidirectional development means some capacities grow while others decline at the same time. Rising crystallized knowledge alongside falling fluid problem solving is the course's signature example of this principle. A is wrong because unidimensional would mean development runs along a single line or capacity. The scenario shows two capacities moving in opposite directions, which is the opposite of unidimensional. B is wrong because discontinuity refers to development proceeding in distinct, qualitative stages, a separate debate from the direction of change. The scenario is about simultaneous gains and losses, not stage-like jumps. D is wrong because calling development fixed and stable ignores that both a gain and a loss are occurring. Stability would predict no change in either ability. Modern developmental science makes a quietly radical claim. Growth and decline are not separate seasons of life but constant companions. Multidirectionality means that within one person, at any age, some abilities are climbing while others are declining, all at once. This replaces the old picture of a single rise and fall curve with many separate trajectories, each on its own schedule. Intelligence itself splits into two systems moving in opposite directions. Fluid intelligence, the quick reasoning used on unfamiliar problems, peaks early and slowly fades, while crystallized intelligence, the accumulated vocabulary and expertise of experience, keeps rising for decades. The same logic explains growth versus development. Growth is a quantitative increase you can measure, like height or vocabulary size, while development is the broader idea, including qualitative reorganizations like new ways of thinking or relating to others. So a person can be slower at novel puzzles, yet wiser and more knowledgeable at the very same time, with no contradiction at all. Question 6. Two researchers argue about why a child is highly aggressive. One emphasizes the child's inherited temperament and brain chemistry. The other emphasizes a harsh home environment and the aggressive models the child observes. Which enduring issue in development are they debating? Your options are A. Nature versus nurture. B. Continuity versus discontinuity. C. Stability versus change. D. Critical versus sensitive periods. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Nature versus nurture. A is correct because the nature versus nurture issue asks how much of who we are comes from heredity and biology versus environment and experience. One researcher stresses inherited biology and the other stresses environment, which is precisely this debate. B is wrong because continuity versus discontinuity concerns whether development is gradual or proceeds in stages, not whether biology or environment is the cause. Neither researcher is arguing about the shape of change over time. C is wrong because stability versus change asks whether early traits persist or can be transformed across life. The debate here is about the source of the behavior, not its permanence. D is wrong because critical versus sensitive periods concerns the timing window in which an experience has its effect. The scenario says nothing about a developmental window. Every theory of development starts by tackling one ancient puzzle. How much of who we become comes from biology, and how much comes from experience? Nature is the contribution of genes, biology, and inherited temperament. Nurture is the contribution of upbringing, culture, learning, and everything a person experiences. Genes don't hand down a finished trait, they hand down a range of possibility. A child might inherit a tendency towards shyness, but family, culture, and experience decide whether that tendency hardens, softens, or reshapes. It's easy to confuse this debate with three others nearby: continuity versus stages, stability versus change, and critical versus sensitive periods. Nature versus nurture is strictly about where a trait comes from, not how it changes over time. The modern, Defensible answer is almost always both. Interacting, an insight that launched entire fields like behavioral genetics and epigenetics. Question 7. A professor points out that Erikson, Piaget, and Kohlberg all describe development as a sequence of qualitatively distinct stages in a fixed order, whereas conditioning and information processing models describe gradual, quantitative change. The professor is contrasting these theories along which enduring issue. Your options are A. Nature versus nurture, B. Continuity versus discontinuity, C. Stability versus change, D. Critical versus sensitive periods. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. Continuity versus discontinuity. B is correct because continuity versus discontinuity is the debate over whether development is smooth and gradual or moves through distinct qualitative stages. Stage theories take the discontinuous side, and learning and information processing models take the continuous side, which is exactly the contrast described. A is wrong because nature versus nurture concerns the relative weight of heredity and environment, not the shape of developmental change. The professor is comparing stage versus gradual change, not biology versus experience. C is wrong because stability versus change asks whether early traits endure across life. The contrast here is about how change unfolds, not whether traits persist. D is wrong because critical versus sensitive periods concerns timing windows for experiences. It does not address whether change is staged or gradual. One of the deepest fault lines in developmental psychology is the question of what change actually looks like. Does development flow smoothly, or does it leap between distinct stages? This is the continuity versus discontinuity debate. The continuous view pictures development as a ramp. Change is incremental and quantitative. A child simply accumulates more memory, faster processing, and a larger vocabulary, with no sharp dividing lines along the way. The discontinuous view pictures development as a staircase. A child does not just get better at thinking, they periodically reorganize into a qualitatively new kind of thinking that the previous stage could not have produced. The grand theories split cleanly along this line. Piaget, Erikson, Freud, and Kohlberg are all discontinuous stage theories. Classical and operant conditioning and the information processing model are continuous, describing change as gradual and quantitative. The fastest way to answer exam questions is to read for signal words. Stages, qualitative change, and fixed sequence point to discontinuity. Gradual, smooth, and quantitative point to continuity. Remember, this debate is about the shape of change, not its source. Keep it separate from the nature versus nurture issue. Question 8. Across several long-term studies, a person's basic temperament measured in infancy predicts related tendencies decades later, making temperament one of the most enduring characteristics across the lifespan. This finding is most often raised in discussions of which enduring issue? Your options are A. Nature versus nurture, B. Continuity versus discontinuity, C. Critical versus sensitive periods, D. Stability versus change. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Stability versus change. D is correct because stability versus change asks whether early traits persist for life or can be fundamentally transformed. Temperament, being largely genetically driven, is highlighted as one of the most stable characteristics across life, anchoring the stability side. A is wrong because nature versus nurture concerns the source of a trait, heredity, or environment. Although temperament has a genetic basis, the point being made here is about its persistence over time, which is the stability change issue. B is wrong because continuity versus discontinuity concerns whether change is gradual or staged. Temperament's persistence is about endurance, not the shape of change. C is wrong because critical versus sensitive periods concerns timing windows for experiences to take effect. The finding is about a trait lasting decades, not a window of opportunity. Do the traits we show as children lock in for life, or can people fundamentally change? This is the stability versus change debate, one of psychology's classic questions about human development. Some psychologists argue that early characteristics endure, so the shy infant becomes the reserved adult. Others insist that experience, relationships, and effort can remake a person over time. Decades of research show both sides capture something real. The real question is which traits lean toward stability and which lean toward change. Temperament is the inborn, biological baseline of mood and reactivity. It's largely genetic, which makes it remarkably stable across a lifetime. Personality builds on top of that baseline, blending temperament with experience, relationships, and choices, which is why personality has far more room to change. Watch for the signal words. Early traits that persist and temperament as a stable baseline point to stability, while personality shifting with experience and people remaking themselves point to change. Remember, this issue is never about where a trait came from. Genetics explain its origin. It's about whether that trait endures or transforms over time. Question 9. A textbook describes weeks 3 through 8 of prenatal development as the window when the major organs take shape and when exposure to a harmful substance causes the most severe structural damage. The identical exposure later in pregnancy does far less structural harm. This kind of all or nothing window is best labeled A. Your options are A. Critical period, B. Sensitive period, C. Sleeper effect, D. Cohort effect. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A. Critical period. A is correct because a critical period is a narrow window during which a particular experience must occur, or during which the organism is most vulnerable, for normal development to proceed. The embryonic period is the classic critical period because major structures must form then, and teratogen damage peaks. B is wrong because a sensitive period is a window of especially responsive development in which learning can still happen later, which is more forgiving than the all or nothing case described. The permanent structural consequences tied to a fixed window mark this as critical rather than sensitive. C is wrong because a sleeper effect refers to a consequence that surfaces long after its cause, not a window of vulnerability. It does not describe the timing of organ formation. D is wrong because a cohort effect is a generational difference that can confound cross-sectional research. It has nothing to do with prenatal vulnerability windows. In development, timing can be everything, and nothing captures that better than the critical period. It's a narrow window of time in which a specific experience must happen, or the organism is especially vulnerable for normal development to proceed. The signal words are simple but strict. Something must occur within a narrow window, or the effect becomes permanent and irreversible. Inside that window, the organism faces its greatest vulnerability. Outside it, the same event barely registers. This is why the embryonic period, roughly weeks 3 through 8 after conception, is the field's clearest example. During these weeks, the heart, neural tube, and other major structures are actively being built. So teratogen striking now can cause major structural damage that the very same exposure would barely cause later. Exam questions test the line between a critical period and its gentler cousin, the sensitive period. A critical period is a closing door with permanent loss if the window is missed, while a sensitive period is merely the optimal timing, still allowing late success. Remember the picture. The same exposure devastates a forming heart in week 5, but does nothing comparable once the blueprint is finished. If the scenario forecloses success entirely, the window is critical. If late success is still possible, it's only sensitive. Question 10. A child who is not exposed to a second language until age 10 still learns it, though it came more easily and naturally to an older sibling who began at age 4. The developmental window for language is therefore best described as A. Your options are A. Critical period, B. Chronosystem, C. Sensitive period, D. Fixed action pattern. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is C. Sensitive period. C is correct because a sensitive period is a window when development is especially responsive to a given experience, but the learning is still possible outside it. Language fits because earlier exposure is easier, yet later learning still succeeds, exactly as the two siblings show. A is wrong because a critical period is all or nothing. The experience must occur within the window or normal development is permanently lost. Because the 10-year-old still learns the language, the window is forgiving, not critical. B is wrong because the chronosystem is Bronfenbrenner's dimension of time and change across the lifespan, not a window for acquiring a skill. It is an environmental systems concept, not a learning window. D is wrong because a fixed action pattern is an innate automatic behavior triggered by a specific stimulus. It does not describe a window for language learning. Not every developmental window slams shut. Some stay open, just harder to walk through as time passes. A sensitive period is a stretch when development is especially responsive to a certain experience, making learning easier and more efficient. But unlike a critical period, the window is optimal rather than mandatory. Miss it, and the skill remains achievable later, just with more effort. The mechanism is the brain's changing plasticity. Early neural systems are unusually open to shaping by input like language, sounds, and grammar. But as they mature, they grow less pliable. That plasticity never vanishes. It simply fades gradually rather than slamming shut. The key test is whether late achievement remains possible. In a sensitive period, someone who misses the ideal window can still succeed with effort, like a sibling learning language later but successfully. In a critical period, missing the window forecloses the outcome entirely. Picture a sensitive period as a door that's widest at just the right time but never fully closes, unlike the critical period's door that shuts for good. Question 11. A 4-year-old wants a cookie before dinner, but instead of grabbing it, waits and asks his mother whether he may have one after he eats. In Freud's model of personality, the structure guiding this realistic, socially acceptable way of satisfying a desire is the your options are A. Id, B. Ego, C. Superego, D. Libido. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is B. Ego. B is correct because the ego operates on the reality principle, finding realistic and socially acceptable ways to satisfy the ID's desires, including delaying gratification. Pausing to ask rather than grabbing is the ego negotiating between desire and reality. A is wrong because the ID operates on the pleasure principle and demands immediate gratification, which would mean grabbing the cookie at once. The child's restraint is the opposite of pure id. C is wrong because the superego is the moral conscience that judges right and wrong, not the practical negotiator that finds a workable route to a goal. The child's behavior is about a realistic strategy, not a moral judgment. D is wrong because libido is Freud's term for pleasure-seeking psychic energy, not one of the 3 personality structures. It is not the part of the mind that plans a realistic course of action. Freud's theory of personality rests on three internal structures that develop in sequence and then spend a lifetime negotiating with one another. The ID demands instant pleasure, the superego judges right from wrong, and the ego sits between them, trying to satisfy desire without ignoring reality or provoking guilt. The ego emerges after the id and operates on the reality principle, searching for a practical way to meet a desire without crashing into the real world or triggering the superego's guilt. The exam trap is confusing the practical ego with the moral superego. So look for signal words. Immediate and impulsive point to the id. Realistic and delaying point to the ego. And guilt or conscience point to the superego. The id supplies the want. The superego supplies the moral break. And the ego brokers the deal between them and reality. That balances Freud's picture of psychological health. Question 12. According to Freud, a child's moral conscience first takes shape as the child identifies with the same-sex parent and internalizes parental rules. During which psychosexual stage does the superego begin to form? Your options are A. Oral, B. Anal, C. Latency, D. Phallic. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is D. Phallic. D is correct because Freud placed the formation of the superego in the phallic stage, roughly ages 3 to 6, when the child resolves the Oedipus or Electra conflict by identifying with the same-sex parent. That identification internalizes parental and societal rules as conscience. A is wrong because the oral stage, birth to about 1 year, centers on gratification through the mouth and supplies Freud's explanation of attachment, not the birth of conscience. The superego has not yet formed this early. B is wrong because the anal stage, roughly ages 1 to 3, centers on toilet training and control, before the moral identification that forms the superego. Conscience comes in the next stage. C is wrong because latency, from about age 6 to puberty, is when sexual urges are quiet and energy goes to school and friendships. The superego has already begun forming by then. It is not the stage of conscience formation. Freud proposed that personality develops through a fixed sequence of psychosexual stages, each centered on a different body zone where the child's pleasure-seeking libido becomes concentrated. The 5 stages, in strict order, are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital, each tied to a specific age range and a specific body focus. During the phallic stage, the child experiences attraction toward the opposite sex parent and rivalry with the same-sex parent, called the Oedipus conflict in boys and the Electra conflict in girls. Resolving this through identification with the same-sex parent is the moment the superego, the moral conscience, is born. Exam questions test whether you can match a scenario to its stage. Feeding and the mouth signal oral. Toilet training signals anal. Conscience and identification signal phallic. And a quiet focus on school signals latency. Remember, feeding anchors the oral stage, but conscience belongs to the phallic stage. The superego doesn't exist until the child identifies with the same-sex parent. Question 13. A new mother bonds with her baby largely through breastfeeding. A theorist explains that the infant becomes attached to her specifically because she satisfies the infant's oral needs and provides the pleasure of feeding. Whose explanation of attachment is this? Your options are A. Freud's psychosexual theory, B. Erikson's psychosocial theory, C. Bandura's social learning theory, D. Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. Freud's psychosexual theory. A is correct because Freud's oral stage account holds that the infant becomes attached to the mother because she satisfies the infant's oral needs and provides pleasure through feeding. This feeding-based bond is exactly the explanation described. B is wrong because Erikson would say the infant's real task is developing basic trust in a reliable caregiver, a secure base, rather than bonding specifically over oral gratification. His emphasis is social trust, not feeding pleasure. C is wrong because Bandura would explain behavior through observation and imitation of models, which does not describe an infant bonding through feeding. Observational learning is not an account of early attachment. D is wrong because Bronfenbrenner would frame development in terms of nested environmental systems, not an infant's oral gratification. His theory is about context, not a feeding-based bond. Long before modern attachment research, Freud offered the first influential explanation for why infants bond so powerfully with their caregivers. Freud rooted this bond in his oral stage, where an infant's pleasure-seeking energy centers on the mouth, expressed through sucking and feeding. The caregiver who feeds the baby becomes the source of its deepest gratification, a bond so tied to feeding it's nicknamed the cupboard love theory. The breast or bottle delivers both nourishment and oral pleasure, making feeding the literal engine of attachment for Freud. Later theorists pushed back. Erikson argued the infant's real task is building basic trust in a reliable caregiver, while contact comfort researchers showed that soothing touch and closeness, not food, may be the true foundation of the bond. Freud, Erikson, and contact comfort all explain the same clingy infant through different mechanisms. When an infant's love is tied specifically to the person who feeds it, the lens on display is Freud's, pleasure rooted in the mouth rather than trust or touch. Question 14. A newborn cries the instant he feels hungry and is satisfied only by immediate feeding, with no capacity to wait or weigh circumstances. In Freud's theory, this demand for instant gratification is governed by which structure operating on the pleasure principle? Your options are A. Ego, B. Superego, C. Id, D. Conscience. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Id. C is correct because the id is present from birth and operates on the pleasure principle, demanding immediate gratification of drives. A newborn who must be fed at once, unable to wait, is behaving purely from the id. A is wrong because the ego runs on the reality principle and develops later in infancy to find realistic ways to meet needs. A newborn's inability to delay shows the ego is not yet in charge. B is wrong because the superego is the moral conscience that forms in early childhood, long after birth. A newborn has no internalized rules guiding the demand to be fed. D is wrong because conscience is simply another name for the superego, which judges right and wrong and is absent at birth. It is not the source of an infant's demand for instant feeding. Freud's model of personality begins with the id, the unconscious engine of desire present from the very first moment of life. The id is the unconscious reservoir of drives and urges. It has no patience, no morality, and no sense of realistic circumstance. Operating purely on the pleasure principle, seek gratification and avoid discomfort immediately. The id is present at birth and runs on pleasure. The ego develops in infancy to supply realism, and the superego arrives in early childhood to supply moral judgment, but the id itself never disappears. Picture the mind as layers. The id sits at the core as an unconscious wellspring of drives, with the ego and superego forming around it over time to manage and channel its relentless pushing. When a scenario shows a total absence of patience and a demand for instant gratification with no thought of consequence, that is the id at work. Question 15. A study guide summarizes the key way Erikson revised Freud. Although both proposed stage theories rooted in early experience, Erikson identified a different fundamental force driving development through the stages. What did Erikson emphasize as that driving force? Your options are A. Unconscious sexual and biological drives, B. Social relationships and culture, C. Reinforcement and punishment, D. Inherited genetic programming. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. Social relationships and culture. B is correct because Erikson reworked Freud's ideas into a lifespan theory in which the driving force is social, rooted in relationships and culture rather than sexual energy. Each stage centers on a social crisis between two outcomes. A is wrong because unconscious sexual and biological drives, or libido, are the driver in Freud's psychosexual theory, which is exactly what Erikson moved away from. This describes Freud, not Erikson's revision. C is wrong because reinforcement and punishment drive behavior in Skinner's operant conditioning, a learning theory unrelated to Erikson's psychosocial stages. Erikson did not build his stages on consequences. D is wrong because inherited genetic programming reflects a strict nature position and is not the social emphasis Erikson stressed. He highlighted relationships and culture, not genes. Freud and Erikson both built stage theories shaped by early experience and inner conflict, but they split over one crucial question: what actually powers development? Freud placed the engine of development in the body itself. Libido, his term for sexual energy, shifts from one body zone to the next, and each stage is named for the zone where that energy concentrates, ending at puberty. Erikson relocated that engine to society, replacing body zones with social crises between the person and family, culture and community, and stretching development across 8 stages, spanning the whole lifespan instead of stopping at puberty. The signal word split the pair: libido, body zones, sexual drive, and the unconscious point to Freud, while social crisis, relationships, culture, identity, and virtue point to Erikson. Remember the one-line contrast. Freud said biology and sexuality drive 5 stages ending at puberty, while Erikson said social relationships and culture drive 8 stages spanning the whole of life. Question 16. A caregiver consistently responds to an infant's cries, feeds her when she is hungry, and comforts her when she is upset. Over her first year, the baby comes to expect that her needs will be met and that the world is reliable. In Erikson's theory, the baby is positively resolving which psychosocial crisis? Your options are A. Autonomy versus shame and doubt, B. Initiative versus guilt, C. Industry versus inferiority, D. Trust versus mistrust. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Trust versus mistrust. D is correct because Erikson's first stage, trust versus mistrust, runs from birth to about 18 months and turns on whether consistent caregiving teaches the infant that the world is reliable. A baby who learns to expect her needs to be met is building basic trust and the virtue of hope. A is wrong because autonomy versus shame and doubt is the second stage, roughly 18 months to 3 years, when toddlers assert independence. The scenario describes an infant in the first year before this crisis. B is wrong because initiative versus guilt is the third stage, about ages 3 to 5, centered on starting plans and play. It comes after the infancy stage described here. C is wrong because industry versus inferiority is the fourth stage, the school years, focused on mastering skills. It is far later than the first year trust building in the scenario. Erikson's very first crisis unfolds before an infant can even speak, Will the world prove reliable, or will it prove threatening? Erikson marked the stage with clear signal words: infancy within the first 18 months, consistent and responsive caregiving, a secure base, and the resulting virtue of hope. No single feeding decides the outcome. It's the accumulation of hundreds of small moments of relief that teaches the infant whether needs get met. A caregiver who reliably shows up becomes what Erikson called a secure base, the platform from which the infant dares to explore the world. A healthy resolution isn't total trust with zero mistrust. It's a balance weighted mostly toward trust, with just enough wariness to spot real danger. And remember, this is trust versus mistrust, not the toddler crisis of autonomy versus shame and doubt that follows. That early, hard-won hope is the bedrock a securely cared-for infant carries forward, the foundation on which autonomy, initiative, and identity are later built. Question 17. A 9-year-old works hard to master multiplication and reading, feels proud and capable when she succeeds at school tasks, and worries that she is falling behind when she struggles. In Erikson's framework, she is working through which crisis? Your options are A. Initiative versus guilt, B. Identity versus role confusion, C. Industry versus inferiority, D. Intimacy versus isolation. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is C. Industry versus inferiority. C is correct because industry versus inferiority is Erikson's 4th stage, spanning roughly ages 5 to 12, when school-age children try to master skills and feel either competent or inferior. A 9-year-old who feels capable when she succeeds and inadequate when she struggles is squarely in this stage. A is wrong because initiative versus guilt, ages 3 to 5, is about starting plans and play, not mastering academic skills and feeling competent. The child here is older and focused on achievement. B is wrong because identity versus role confusion belongs to adolescence, ages 12 to 18, when teens assemble a coherent sense of self. A 9-year-old has not yet reached this stage. D is wrong because intimacy versus isolation is the young adult stage about forming committed relationships. It is many years beyond the school-age child described. In the school years, roughly ages 5 to 12, Erikson's framework enters its 4th stage, industry versus inferiority. The crisis is about competence, whether a child comes to feel capable and productive or inadequate and outmatched. Suddenly there are skills to master, and the child cannot help noticing who can and who cannot. School widens a child's world beyond the family into teachers, classmates, and shared tasks, the arena where competence is measured against peers for the first time. This stage sits in a larger sequence. Initiative in early childhood is about starting plans. Industry in the school years is about mastering skills. And identity in adolescence is about defining oneself. Each success deposits confidence, yielding the virtue Erikson called competency, while repeated failure breeds inferiority. Remember, skill mastery and peer comparison in the school years signal industry versus inferiority. Question 18. A 16-year-old spends the year trying out different peer groups, musical tastes, and political beliefs while repeatedly asking herself who she really is. In Erikson's theory, she is grappling with which crisis, whose virtue is fidelity. Your options are A. Identity versus role confusion, B. Intimacy versus isolation, C. Generativity versus stagnation, D. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Identity versus role confusion. A is correct because identity versus role confusion is Erikson's 5th stage, ages 12 to 18, when adolescents experiment with roles and values to form a coherent self, and its virtue is fidelity. Trying on different groups and beliefs while asking who she is captures the stage exactly. B is wrong because intimacy versus isolation is the next stage, young adulthood, about fusing one's identity with another in committed relationships with the virtue of love. The teen is still forming her own identity, not yet committing to a partner. C is wrong because generativity versus stagnation is the middle adulthood stage about contributing to the next generation with the virtue of care. It is decades beyond a 16-year-old. D is wrong because autonomy versus shame and doubt is the toddler stage about asserting independence with the virtue of will. The adolescent's identity exploration is a much later crisis. Adolescence brings Erikson's fifth crisis, identity versus role confusion, the work of building a stable, coherent sense of self from about age 12 to 18. New abstract thinking and social pressure push teenagers to start choosing a path in work, values, and belonging, even as their childhood identity no longer fits. Successfully resolving this crisis produces fidelity, the capacity to commit faithfully to chosen values and people. Erikson called the mechanism active experimentation. Adolescents sample peer groups, values and beliefs, and styles of dress, much like trying on clothes, to discover which self actually fits. This trying on is not instability to be corrected. It is the developmental work itself. As scattered roles and beliefs gradually fuse into one authentic, durable identity. Identity sits between industry, the school-age mastery of skills, and intimacy, the young adult's task of fusing oneself with a partner. A self must exist before it can be shared, so the work of identity always comes first. Question 19. A 52-year-old engineer mentors junior colleagues, coaches a youth robotics team, and says he wants to leave things better for the next generation. The course identifies the stage he is in as the longest of all Erikson stages. Which stage and virtue does this describe? Your options are A. Identity versus role confusion, fidelity. B. Intimacy versus isolation, love. C. Integrity versus despair, wisdom. D. Generativity versus stagnation, care. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is D. Generativity versus stagnation, care. D is correct because generativity versus stagnation is Erikson's seventh stage, ages 40 to 65, when adults invest in the next generation through family, work, and mentoring, and its virtue is care. The course calls it the longest stage encompassing procreativity, productivity, and creativity. A is wrong because identity versus role confusion is the adolescent stage of forming a self, with the virtue fidelity. A 52-year-old mentoring others is well past identity formation. B is wrong because intimacy versus isolation is the young adult stage of forming committed relationships, with the virtue love. The scenario is about contributing to the next generation, not establishing a partnership. C is wrong because integrity versus despair is the final stage, age 65 and up, about reviewing one's life. With the virtue wisdom, the engineer is actively building the future, not looking back on a finished life. Middle adulthood brings Erikson's seventh crisis, generativity versus stagnation, unfolding across the long stretch from roughly age 40 to 65. By midlife, adults have already built identity, intimacy, and career. So the crisis asks whether they'll turn outward to nurture others or turn inward into self-absorption. Those who invest in the future gain the virtue of care, while those who don't feel stuck in stagnant routine. Erikson described generativity as three intertwined forms: procreativity, raising children; productivity, meaningful work; and creativity, generating new ideas. This breadth means generativity isn't only about parenting, teaching, mentoring, and craft all count. Picture care radiating outward, from the self to family, to mentees and community, and finally to the next generation and the wider world. This forward-looking investment is what separates generativity from integrity, Erikson's final stage of looking back on a completed life. A person mentoring others in midlife is building tomorrow, not reviewing yesterday. Question 20. An 80-year-old looks back over his life, judges it meaningful and well-lived, and accepts both his accomplishments and his regrets with peace. In Erikson's theory, he is positively resolving which crisis and what virtue results. Your options are A. Generativity versus stagnation, care. B. Integrity versus despair, wisdom. C. Trust versus mistrust, hope. D. Identity versus role confusion, fidelity. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. Integrity versus despair, wisdom. B is correct because ego integrity versus despair is Erikson's 8th and final stage, age 65 and up, in which older adults review their lives and either accept them or sink into regret. Successful resolution yields wisdom. An elder who looks back with acceptance and peace is achieving integrity. A is wrong because generativity versus stagnation is the middle adulthood stage of contributing to the next generation with the virtue care. The scenario describes reviewing a completed life, which belongs to the later stage. C is wrong because trust versus mistrust is the infancy stage about learning the world is reliable with the virtue hope. It is the first stage, not the life review of old age. D is wrong because identity versus role confusion is the adolescent stage of forming a self, with the virtue fidelity. An 80-year-old reflecting on his whole life is far beyond identity formation. Erikson's theory ends with its 8th and final crisis, ego integrity versus despair, the struggle of late adulthood. In this final stage, the aging adult looks back across an entire life and must integrate it, accepting its successes and failures, rather than being consumed by despair over missed opportunities. Success here yields the virtue of wisdom, a peaceful acceptance of life and death. This backward gaze is called a life review, a deliberate or spontaneous revisiting of the past that weighs successes against failures. Achieving integrity doesn't mean pretending the life was perfect. It means accepting the whole imperfect story as meaningful and one's own. Examiners often contrast this with generativity, the stage before it. Generativity is midlife's forward-looking investment in the next generation, while integrity is late life's backward-looking acceptance of the past already lived. So, when a scenario shows an older adult reflecting on a long life and finding peace with it, that points to integrity versus despair and the virtue of wisdom, not generativity. Question 21. A toddler has learned the word doggy for the family dog. At a farm, she points to a goat and then a sheep and calls each one doggy, fitting these new four-legged animals into the category she already has without changing it. In Piaget's terms, she is using. Your options are A. Assimilation, B. Accommodation, C. Conservation, D. Equilibration. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. Assimilation. A is correct because assimilation is fitting new information into an existing schema without changing the schema. Forcing the goat and sheep into her current doggy category is assimilation because the category itself stays the same. B is wrong because accommodation would require her to change or create a schema, such as building separate goat and sheep categories. She has not modified her thinking yet, so it is not accommodation. C is wrong because conservation is the understanding that quantity stays the same despite changes in appearance, a concrete operational achievement unrelated to naming animals. It does not describe categorizing. D is wrong because equilibration is the overall balancing process that drives movement between assimilation and accommodation. The specific act of slotting new animals into an old category is assimilation, not the general balancing process. Piaget saw children as active builders of knowledge, not empty vessels, a view called constructivism. Kids organize experience into mental categories called schemas, and one key process keeps those schemas growing: assimilation. A schema is a mental framework for a category of experience, like an infant's grasping schema, a toddler's doggy schema, or an adult's restaurant schema. Assimilation is how new experiences get absorbed into these existing schemas without changing them. The classic example: a child who knows the word dog sees a goat and calls it a dog too. Because it is furry, four-legged, and has a tail, the dog schema hasn't changed at all. The goat has simply been squeezed into the category that already existed. Assimilation absorbs new information into an unchanged schema, while accommodation changes the schema itself to fit new reality. Together, balanced by equilibration, the ongoing search for mental harmony, these two processes push a child's thinking to more advanced levels. Whenever a schema stays intact while new experiences are simply folded into it, that's assimilation at work, in children and adults alike. Question 22. After repeatedly calling every four-legged animal doggy, a child is shown that a horse is not a dog. She builds a separate horse category, so she now labels horses correctly while keeping doggy for dogs. This change in her mental categories is an example of: your options are assimilation, B, centration, C, accommodation, D, reversibility. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is C, accommodation. C is correct because accommodation is changing or creating a schema to fit new information that does not fit the existing one. Building a new horse category so she stops miscalling horses is accommodation because the schema itself changed. A is wrong because assimilation would mean forcing the horse into her existing doggy category without change, which is what she did before. The scenario describes the moment her thinking actually changed, which is accommodation. B is wrong because centration is focusing on a single feature of a situation while ignoring others, a pre-operational limitation. It does not describe revising a category. D is wrong because reversibility is the concrete operational ability to mentally reverse a sequence of steps. It is unrelated to creating a new animal category. Piaget said children build knowledge through two processes, but accommodation is the one that creates real, lasting change. When new experience fits a schema, assimilation keeps things balanced. When it doesn't fit, disequilibrium creates discomfort that pushes the child to accommodate, reshaping or building a new schema to restore balance at a higher level. Take the classic case: a child who calls every four-legged animal a dog meets a horse. Simply stretching the dog schema no longer works. So the child builds a new horse schema and narrows the dog schema's boundaries to exclude it. Watch for these signal phrases: changing the schema, creating a new category, revising one's thinking, and adjusting to fit reality. Whenever the mental category itself changes, that's accommodation at work. Assimilation handles the new by leaving the old intact. Accommodation handles the new by rebuilding the old. Together, this back and forth carries children toward a better understanding of the world. Question 23. An 8-month-old happily lifts a blanket to find a toy that was hidden under it while she watched, and she laughs during games of peekaboo. The cognitive achievement she has reached, the landmark of Piaget's first stage, is: your options are A. Conservation. B. Object permanence. C. Symbolic thought. D. Hypothetical deductive reasoning. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. Object permanence. B is correct because object permanence is the understanding that objects continue to exist even when out of sight, the great achievement of the sensoromotor stage and typically acquired by about 8 months. Searching for a hidden toy shows she knows it still exists. A is wrong because conservation is mastered much later, in the concrete operational stage, and concerns quantity staying constant despite changes in shape. An 8-month-old is far from this ability. C is wrong because symbolic thought, using words and images to represent absent objects, blossoms in the pre-operational stage after infancy. It is not the landmark of the sensoromotor stage. D is wrong because hypothetical deductive reasoning is a formal operational ability that appears in adolescence. An infant searching under a blanket is many stages away from it. Piaget's first stage of cognitive development, the sensoromotor stage, stretches from birth to about age 2, when infants know the world through senses and motor action rather than thought. The infant moves from pure reflex toward deliberate, goal-directed action, and finally toward the first sparks of symbolic thought by the end of this stage. The crowning achievement of this stage is object permanence, the understanding that a toy hidden under a blanket still exists even though it can't be seen. Searching for it proves the infant is holding a mental representation of the toy in mind. Around the same age, infants start delighting in peekaboo and hide and seek, and begin showing stranger anxiety, because they can now tell the familiar from the unfamiliar. Later research suggests object permanence may actually emerge even earlier than 8 months, meaning Piaget's timetable, not his sequence, was likely too late. Keep object permanence, knowing a hidden object still exists, separate from conservation, the later realization that quantity stays the same despite appearance. Question 24. A 3-year-old scolds the coffee table after stubbing her toe, insisting that table is mean. It hit me. Attributing feelings and intentions to a lifeless object in this way is a hallmark of pre-operational thought, called. Your options are A. Egocentrism, B. Conservation, C. Centration, D. Animism. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Animism. D is correct because animism is attributing lifelike qualities, such as feelings and intentions, to inanimate objects, a classic feature of pre-operational thinking. Believing the table is mean and acted against her on purpose is a textbook example. A is wrong because egocentrism is the inability to take another person's point of view, assuming others see and feel as you do. The child is not failing to take a viewpoint, she is treating an object as alive. B is wrong because conservation is the understanding that quantity is unchanged by rearrangement gained in the next stage. It has nothing to do with treating a table as alive. C is wrong because centration is focusing on one feature of a situation while ignoring the rest. Although pre-operational, it does not describe ascribing life and intent to an object. From about age 2 to 7, children enter Piaget's pre-operational stage, a period defined as much by new abilities as by missing ones. The child gains symbolic thought, using words and pretend play to stand for things not present, but lacks logical operations. This produces egocentrism, centration, and animism, 3 features that all stem from reasoning by appearance rather than logic. Animism shows this most vividly. A fallen toy is called tired. A bump table is mean and did it on purpose, and the moon is said to follow the child home. These are not random fancies, but a mind projecting its own inner life onto everything around it. Exam questions hinge on telling these apart. Animism means granting an object life and intention, like a mean table. Egocentrism means assuming others share the child's exact viewpoint. And failing conservation means judging a tall, thin glass as holding more, because the height looks bigger while the width is ignored. The pre-operational stage is the age of appearances and imagination without logic. Only in the next, concrete operational stage does the child gain reversibility and finally master conservation. Question 25. A child can now reason logically about concrete situations. She conserves quantity, sorts objects into categories, and arranges sticks from shortest to longest, yet she still struggles with abstract, purely hypothetical problems. She is in which Piaget stage? Your options are A. Concrete operational, B. Formal operational, C. Pre-operational, D. Sensorimotor. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A. Concrete operational. A is correct because the concrete operational stage, roughly ages 7 to 11, brings logical reasoning about concrete things, including conservation, classification, and seriation, while abstract and hypothetical reasoning is still shaky. The described abilities and the standing limitation match this stage precisely. B is wrong because the formal operational stage adds abstract and hypothetical deductive reasoning, which this child still struggles with. Her difficulty with hypotheticals shows she has not yet reached formal operations. C is wrong because pre-operational children, ages 2 to 7, cannot yet conserve and reason from appearances rather than logic. This child already conserves and seriates, so she is past pre-operational. D is wrong because the sensoromotor stage covers infancy and knowing the world through senses and action. A child who conserves and classifies is far beyond it. Around age 7, children enter Piaget's concrete operational stage, gaining real mental logic for the very first time. But that logic only works on things they can see, touch, or picture. This stage brings a cluster of linked skills. Conservation, understanding quantity stays the same despite shape changes. Classification, sorting objects into groups, seriation, ordering items by size, and reversibility, mentally undoing a sequence, which is what makes conservation possible at all. The classic demonstration is pouring juice from a short wide glass into a tall thin one. The concrete operational child now knows the amount hasn't changed, even though the shape looks different. The boundary examiner's test is this: concrete operational logic handles real, tangible situations but filters on pure hypotheticals, while the later formal operational stage adds comfort with abstraction and scientific, hypothesis-driven reasoning. A child who conserves and orders objects but stumbles on abstract questions is concrete operational. The logic is there, just tethered to the tangible world. Question 26. A first grader can read simple words on her own, but can read more challenging passages successfully when a teacher offers hints and prompts along the way. Vygotsky's term for this gap between what she can do alone and what she can do with guidance is the... Your options are A. Sensitive period, B. Schema, C. Zone of proximal development, D. Central executive. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is C. Zone of proximal development. C is correct because the zone of proximal development is the gap between what a learner can do alone and what the same learner can do with guidance from a more capable person. Reading harder passages only with the teacher's help defines that zone exactly. A is wrong because a sensitive period is a developmental window when learning is especially easy, a maturational timing idea, not the gap between solo and assisted performance. It is unrelated to guided reading. B is wrong because A schema is Piaget's mental framework for organizing information, not Vygotsky's gap between independent and assisted ability. It does not name the difference in performance with and without help. D is wrong because the central executive is the attention managing component of working memory in the information processing model. It is not Vygotsky's concept for guided learning. Lev Vygotsky agreed that children build their own understanding, but he insisted the process is fundamentally social, more like an apprentice learning from skilled guides than a lone scientist exploring alone. Picture a child's skills in 3 bands: tasks already mastered alone, tasks still too hard even with help, and in between, the zone of proximal development, tasks the child can manage only with guidance. This zone sits between what a child can do independently and what the same child can do with a more knowledgeable other supplying hints and prompts. Vygotsky argued this in-between gap, not solitary effort, is where real learning happens and development gets pulled forward. The nuance to catch, the zone of proximal development names the gap itself, while scaffolding is the separate term for the support that carries a learner across it, offered by a more knowledgeable other. So a scenario describing the gap between alone and assisted performance is about the zone of proximal development, while a scenario about fading help is about scaffolding. Question 27. As a child learns to tie his shoes, his father at first guides his hands through every step, then gives only verbal reminders, and finally withdraws all help once the boy can do it himself. Vygotsky's name for this temporary, gradually removed support is: your options are A. Reinforcement, B. Assimilation, C. Habituation, D. Scaffolding. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is D. Scaffolding. D is correct because scaffolding is the temporary support a parent or teacher provides and then gradually withdraws as the learner becomes able to perform the task independently. Guiding the child's hands, fading to reminders, then removing help is scaffolding in action. A is wrong because reinforcement is a consequence that increases the behavior in operant conditioning, not the fading support of a teacher. The scenario describes guidance being withdrawn, not a rewarding consequence. B is wrong because assimilation is Piaget's process of fitting new information into an existing schema. It does not describe temporary teaching support. C is wrong because habituation is the decline in an infant's response to a repeated stimulus, a research technique, not a form of instructional support. It is unrelated to teaching a skill. If the zone of proximal development is the space where learning is ripest, scaffolding is the support that helps a learner cross it. It's temporary help from someone more capable, designed to disappear once it's no longer needed. Scaffolding comes from Vygotsky's idea that higher mental abilities are first built through social interaction before becoming internal. A parent, teacher, or skilled peer offers just enough help to let the learner succeed, no more, and slowly pulls that help back as the learner's own competence takes over. The term borrows its image directly from construction. Scaffolding on a building props up work in progress, and once the building can stand on its own, the scaffolding comes down, just as a learner's support is dismantled once they can manage alone. Picture a parent teaching a child to tie shoelaces. At first, the parent guides the child's hands through every loop, then shifts to spoken reminders of the next step, and finally withdraws entirely, leaving the child tying the laces alone. The help shrank exactly as the skill grew. Scaffolding is the support itself. The zone of proximal development is the space that support operates in. Reinforcement, from an entirely different theory, is a consequence that strengthens behavior. Whenever help is deliberately faded as skill improves, that fading is the decisive sign of scaffolding. Question 28. Teacher A sets out materials and lets children discover on their own how a balance scale works. Teacher B sits beside a child, gives just enough hints to reach the next step, and pulls back the help as he succeeds. The contrast between these two approaches best reflects the difference between. Your options are A. Two behaviorist theories of reinforcement, B. Piaget's cognitive constructivism and Vygotsky's social constructivism, C. Classical and operant conditioning, D. Nature and nurture theories of morality. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. Piaget's cognitive constructivism and Vygotsky's social constructivism. B is correct because both teachers treat children as active builders of knowledge. But teacher A reflects Piaget's cognitive constructivism, emphasizing independent self-driven discovery, while teacher B reflects Vygotsky's social constructivism, teaching within the zone of proximal development through scaffolding. The contrast is precisely cognitive versus social constructivism. A is wrong because neither teacher is using reinforcement or describing behaviorist principles. Both assume the child actively constructs understanding. Behaviorism does not fit this constructivist scenario. C is wrong because classical and operant conditioning are learning theories about association and consequences, not about discovery versus guided construction of knowledge. They do not capture this contrast. D is wrong because nature versus nurture theories of morality concern moral reasoning and its origins, not the two styles of supporting cognitive discovery shown here. The scenario is about constructivism, not morality. Piaget and Vygotsky both believe children build their own understanding, but they disagree sharply on how that building happens. Piaget and Vygotsky share the same foundation. Children actively construct knowledge. They are never empty vessels, and both reject purely passive learning. Piaget's cognitive constructivism relies on independent discovery, as the child acts on objects and adjusts existing schemas. Vygotsky's social constructivism relies on scaffolding from a more capable other, working within the zone of proximal development. Picture Vygotsky's zone of proximal development as 3 rings, what the child can already do alone, the middle zone where a more knowledgeable other scaffolds new skills, and the outer edge of what's still out of reach. Remember the shared root and the divided branch. Both believe children construct knowledge, but Piaget locates it in independent activity, while Vygotsky locates it in social interaction. Question 29. In the information processing model of memory, one component of working memory directs attention, decides what to focus on, and monitors which strategies are being used. Which component performs this managing role? Your options are A. The central executive, B. The phonological loop, C. The visuospatial sketchpad, D. Sensory memory. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. The central executive. A is correct because the central executive is the manager of working memory. It allocates attention and monitors strategies while coordinating the other components. Directing focus and overseeing strategy use is exactly its job. B is wrong because the phonological loop handles auditory and verbal information, such as rehearsing a phone number, rather than managing attention. It is a storage component, not the manager. C is wrong because the visuospatial sketchpad handles visual and spatial information, such as picturing a route. It stores imagery and does not allocate attention. D is wrong because sensory memory briefly holds raw sensory input for a fraction of a second before it is processed. It is a separate store entirely, not the part of working memory that manages strategy. Unlike Piaget's stages, the information processing approach treats the mind like a computer, taking in, storing, and retrieving information. Growth here is gradual and continuous, older kids aren't running different software. They're just faster, hold more, and use better strategies. Sensory memory briefly registers raw input from the senses. What gets attended to moves into working memory, the small, busy conscious workspace where thinking happens, and deeply processed information moves on into long-term memory. Working memory is the bottleneck, since everything we consciously think about must pass through it. Working memory itself has parts. The central executive is the manager, directing attention and coordinating everything, while two subordinate systems do the storing. The phonological loop holds sounds and words, and the visuo-spatial sketchpad holds images and spatial layouts. The central executive is the seat of control. It allocates attention, decides what to focus on, coordinates the loop and sketchpad, and monitors which strategies are being used. Much of what improves across childhood, concentration, resisting distraction, and juggling information, comes from this executive control maturing. When you spot a scenario about managing attention or monitoring strategy, that's the central executive. Sounds and words point to the phonological loop, and images and space point to the visuospatial sketchpad. Question 30. A man rides a bicycle smoothly without consciously recalling how to balance or pedal. The memory system that stores this kind of automatic skill, which does not require conscious recollection, is... Your options are A. Semantic memory, B. Episodic memory, C. Non-declarative memory, D. Sensory memory. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Non-declarative memory. C is correct because non-declarative, or implicit, memory stores automatic skills and conditioned responses that are performed without conscious recollection. Such as riding a bike, the effortless unconscious nature of the skill marks it as non-declarative. A is wrong because semantic memory is a declarative system for general facts not tied to a time, such as knowing a capital city. Riding a bike is a skill, not a consciously recalled fact. B is wrong because episodic memory is a declarative system for specific events tied to a time and place, such as a past birthday. A motor skill performed automatically is not an episodic recollection. D is wrong because sensory memory briefly registers raw sensory input and is not where lasting skills are stored. It cannot hold a learned ability like cycling. Long-term memory isn't one single storehouse. It splits into two systems sorted by whether you consciously recall them or not. Declarative memory holds facts and events you can deliberately recall and put into words. Non-declarative memory holds skills, habits, and conditioned responses that operate automatically, without any conscious act of recollection. Within declarative memory, semantic memory stores general facts, like a country's capital, while episodic memory stores personal events, like a first day at a new job. Non-declarative memory, by contrast, stores automatic skills like riding a bike, revealed through performance rather than conscious recall. These two systems even depend on somewhat different brain structures. The hippocampus supports declarative memory, while the basal ganglia and cerebellum support non-declarative skills. That's why a person can forget the lesson in which a skill was learned, yet still keep the skill itself. The test is simple. If a memory is consciously recalled, it's declarative, semantic for facts, episodic for events. If it's performed automatically without recollection, like riding a bike, it's non-declarative. Question 31. A baby who once received a painful injection at a clinic now begins to cry the moment she smells the clinic's antiseptic hallway before anyone touches her. This automatic fear response, attached to a new cue through association, is an example of... Your options are A. Operant conditioning, B. Classical conditioning, C. Observational learning, D. Negative punishment. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. Classical conditioning. B is correct because classical conditioning is learning by association, in which a previously neutral stimulus comes to trigger an automatic response after being paired with something that already does. The antiseptic smell, paired with the painful shot, now triggers crying on its own, just as in Watson's little Albert study. A is wrong because operant conditioning involves changing a voluntary behavior because of its consequences, not an involuntary reflex triggered by a cue. The baby's crying is an automatic emotional reaction, not a chosen behavior shaped by reward or punishment. C is wrong because observational learning is acquiring behavior by watching and imitating a model. The baby did not learn to fear the smell by watching someone else. She learned it through direct association. D is wrong because negative punishment removes something desirable to decrease a behavior. Nothing is being removed here, and crying is a reflexive response, not a behavior being reduced. Classical conditioning is one of the founding ideas of behaviorism, explaining how learning can happen without any deliberate choice at all. Here, a neutral stimulus gets paired with something that naturally triggers a response, until the neutral cue alone produces that same automatic reaction. This happens through repeated pairing, not conscious decision, and it was first mapped by physiologist Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov noticed his dog salivating not just to food, but to the bell that reliably preceded it. Food is the unconditioned stimulus, salivation to it the unconditioned response. Once paired repeatedly, the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus, and salivation to the bell alone is the conditioned response. John Watson extended this to humans, pairing a neutral white rat with a sudden loud noise until the child, little Albert, came to fear the rat alone. The fear response, like salivation, was automatic and reflexive, not a deliberate choice. The key distinction to remember is voluntary versus involuntary. Classical conditioning captures automatic, reflexive responses through association, while operant conditioning shapes voluntary behavior through its consequences. Question 32. A parent takes away a teenager's video game privileges after he breaks curfew, and his curfew breaking decreases over the following weeks. In operant terms, removing a desired privilege in order to reduce a behavior is. Your options are A. Positive reinforcement, B. Negative reinforcement, C. Positive punishment, D. Negative punishment. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Negative punishment. D is correct because negative punishment removes a desirable stimulus in order to decrease a behavior. Taking away the games to reduce curfew breaking removes something the teen wants and lowers the behavior, which fits negative punishment. A is wrong because positive reinforcement adds a pleasant stimulus to increase a behavior. Here something is removed and the behavior decreases, the opposite of positive reinforcement. B is wrong because negative reinforcement removes an unpleasant stimulus to increase a behavior. The behavior here goes down, not up, so it cannot be reinforcement of any kind. C is wrong because positive punishment adds an unpleasant stimulus to decrease a behavior, such as assigning an extra chore. In this case, a privilege is taken away rather than something unpleasant added. Operant conditioning is BF, Skinner's theory of how voluntary behavior is shaped by its consequences. Unlike classical conditioning's automatic reflexes, this system strengthens or weakens deliberate actions based on what happens right after them. The whole system rests on two pairs of terms. Reinforcement always increases behavior, while punishment always decreases it. Separately, positive means something is added, and negative means something is removed. These words never mean good or bad. Combining the two pairs gives four possibilities. Positive reinforcement adds something pleasant to raise behavior. Negative reinforcement removes something unpleasant to raise behavior. Positive punishment adds something unpleasant to lower behavior. And negative punishment removes something pleasant to lower behavior. Consider taking away a teenager's gaming privileges to stop rule breaking. A desirable stimulus is removed, and the behavior goes down. That combination of removal and decrease is exactly what defines negative punishment, even though nothing harsh was added. To avoid the trap of reading negative as bad, ask 2 questions in order. Did the behavior increase or decrease? And was a stimulus added or removed? A privilege removed to decrease behavior always lands on negative punishment. Question 33. A teenager's car beeps annoyingly until he fastens his seatbelt and the beeping stops the instant he buckles. Over time, he buckles up immediately and the buckling behavior increases. This is an example of your options are A. Positive punishment, B. Negative punishment, C. Negative reinforcement, D. Classical conditioning. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is C. Negative reinforcement. C is correct because negative reinforcement removes an unpleasant stimulus in order to increase a behavior. The annoying beep is taken away when he buckles, and buckling increases, which is the definition of negative reinforcement. A is wrong because positive punishment adds an unpleasant stimulus to decrease a behavior. Here, an unpleasant stimulus is removed and the behavior increases, so it is reinforcement, not punishment. B is wrong because negative punishment removes a desirable stimulus to decrease a behavior. The buckling behavior actually increases, so this cannot be punishment. D is wrong because classical conditioning involves an automatic, involuntary response to an associated cue. Buckling a seatbelt is a voluntary behavior changed by its consequence, which is operant, not classical. Negative reinforcement is one of the most misread ideas in psychology, often mistaken for punishment. In reality, it's a way of strengthening behavior, not suppressing it. Skinner's framework combines 2 dimensions. Reinforcement or punishment shows whether behavior rises or falls, while positive or negative shows whether a stimulus is added or removed. Negative reinforcement sits in the cell where removing something raises behavior. Consider a car that beeps insistently until the driver fastens the seatbelt. Buckling removes the annoying beep, and that relief strengthens the buckling behavior. So soon the driver buckles immediately just to prevent the noise from starting. To identify negative reinforcement, ask 2 questions. Did the behavior increase or decrease? And was a stimulus added or removed? If behavior rises because something unpleasant was taken away, that's negative reinforcement, never punishment. Punishment always decreases behavior, while negative reinforcement always increases it by removing something aversive. Don't let the word negative override that decisive fact. Question 34. In a classic study, children who watched an adult behave aggressively toward an inflatable doll later imitated that same aggression themselves, even without being rewarded for it. This demonstration of learning by watching a model is associated with which theorist? Your options are A. Bandura, B. Skinner, C. Pavlov, D. Kohlberg. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Bandura. A is correct because Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiments showed that children imitate aggression they observe in a model, with no direct reinforcement of the child required. Learning by observation and imitation is the heart of his social learning theory. B is wrong because Skinner's operant conditioning explains behavior through reinforcement and punishment of the learner's own actions, not learning by watching others. The study specifically showed learning without direct reward. C is wrong because Pavlov studied classical conditioning. the association of two stimuli to produce a reflex, as with his salivating dogs. Imitating observed aggression is not a conditioned reflex. D is wrong because Kohlberg studied the development of moral reasoning through dilemmas, not the observational learning of behavior. The Bobo doll study is not about moral stages. Skinner showed that consequences shape behavior, but Albert Bandura asked a bigger question. How do people learn so much, so quickly, without being rewarded for every single thing they do? Bandura argued that behavior is also acquired through observation, modeling, and imitation, not just reinforcement and punishment. A child doesn't need to be personally rewarded for every word or habit. Simply watching parents, siblings, and peers is often enough, especially when the model is seen being rewarded. In Bandura's landmark study, children watched an adult hit and kick an inflatable Bobo doll. Afterward, those same children imitated the aggressive acts, even though they themselves had never been rewarded for aggression. Proof that observation alone can produce new behavior. Bandura later renamed his framework social cognitive theory to highlight the mental steps between seeing and doing, paying attention to the model, retaining what was observed, being able to reproduce it, and feeling motivated to act. Classical conditioning works through association between stimuli, operant conditioning through direct consequences to one's own behavior, and Bandura's observational learning through simply watching a model, no personal reward required, as when a child starts saying please after seeing a sibling praised for it. Question 35. A student who firmly believes she is capable of passing a difficult statistics course studies harder and persists longer when problems get tough than a classmate who doubts his ability. Bandura's term for this belief in one's own ability to succeed at a task is: your options are A. Self-esteem, B. Self-efficacy, C. Reciprocal determinism, D. Self-concept. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is B. Self-efficacy. B is correct because self-efficacy is a person's belief in their own ability to succeed at a specific task, and Bandura argued it predicts effort and persistence. The student's confidence driving her to study harder and persist is self-efficacy. A is wrong because self-esteem is a person's overall sense of self-worth, a global evaluation rather than a task-specific belief about capability. The scenario is about confidence in succeeding at a particular task. C is wrong because reciprocal determinism is Bandura's idea that the person, their behavior, and the environment all influence one another. It describes a mutual influence model, not a belief in one's ability. D is wrong because self-concept is the broad set of beliefs a person holds about who they are. It is more general than the task-specific confidence that defines self-efficacy. Among Bandura's many contributions, self-efficacy remains one of the most useful ideas in psychology. It's your belief that you can succeed at a specific task in front of you. Self-efficacy is narrow and focused. It's the belief you can accomplish this particular task, separate from your actual skill level or your overall sense of worth. That belief is what pushes you to try harder and keep going when things get difficult. This belief fits into Bandura's broader social cognitive theory, where person, behavior, and environment mutually shape one another. Two people with identical skills but different beliefs about themselves will act very differently in the same environment. Exam questions often test whether you can separate self-efficacy from three neighboring ideas: self-esteem, a global sense of worth; self-concept, your overall beliefs about who you are; and reciprocal determinism, the mutual influence among person, behavior, and environment. A scenario about confidence in one task driving effort and persistence points specifically to self-efficacy. So whenever a scenario centers on confidence in a particular task fueling effort and persistence, the answer is self-efficacy, not self-esteem or self-concept. Question 36. Asked whether a man should steal an overpriced drug to save his dying wife, a child answers, no, because he would get caught and thrown in jail. Scoring the reasoning rather than the choice. This justification reflects which Kohlberg level? Your options are A. Conventional, B. Post-conventional, C. Universal ethical principles, D. Pre-conventional. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is D. Pre-conventional. D is correct because pre-conventional morality is self-centered, focused on avoiding punishment and serving one's own interest, and is typical of young children. Refusing to steal merely to avoid getting caught and punished is classic stage 1 pre-conventional reasoning. A is wrong because conventional morality is centered on gaining approval and upholding laws and social duty. The level where most adults reason, fear of personal punishment is more basic than concern for law or approval. B is wrong because post-conventional morality reasons from abstract, self-chosen principles that can outrank the law. Avoiding jail for oneself is the opposite of principled reasoning above the law. C is wrong because universal ethical principles name stage 6, the highest post-conventional stage, where decisions rest on principles such as the supreme value of human life. Fear of being caught sits far below this level. Lawrence Kohlberg extended Piaget's idea of developmental stages to moral reasoning, using dilemmas like the famous story of a man deciding whether to steal a drug to save his dying wife. What mattered to Kohlberg wasn't the yes or no answer, but the reasoning behind it, which he sorted into 3 broad levels, each with 2 stages. Pre-conventional morality centers entirely on the self, before rules of society are internalized. In stage 1, the standard is obedience and avoiding punishment. In stage 2, the standard shifts to self-interest and pursuing reward. In both stages, moral authority lies outside the self in the form of personal consequences. Picture the drug dilemma. One child says the man should not steal because he would be caught and jailed, reasoning at stage 1. Another says he should steal it because he needs his wife to care for him, reasoning at stage 2. Both sit at the same pre-conventional level because both are anchored in consequences to the self. Pre-conventional reasoning centers on the self and its consequences. Conventional reasoning centers on others and the law, and post-conventional reasoning centers on abstract principle. A justification resting on punishment or personal gain always belongs to that first, lowest level. 2 people can reach the same verdict for entirely different reasons that belong to different levels. Whenever a justification is built on getting caught, being punished, or personal reward, that reasoning is pre-conventional, no matter how the final answer sounds. Question 37. A researcher notes that when adults are given moral dilemmas, most justify their answers by appealing to obeying the law, fulfilling social duties, or being seen as a good person. According to Kohlberg, most adults reason at which level? Your options are A. Conventional, B. Pre-conventional, C. Post-conventional, D. Premoral. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. Conventional. A is correct because conventional morality defines right and wrong by what others approve of and what the law requires, and Kohlberg held that most adults reason at this level. Appealing to laws, duties, and being a good person are its hallmarks. B is wrong because pre-conventional morality is driven by avoiding punishment and seeking personal reward, typical of children before about age 9. Most adults have moved beyond this self-centered level. C is wrong because post-conventional morality, reasoning from self-chosen universal principles, is rare and reached by relatively few adults. It is not where most adults operate. D is wrong because premoral is not one of Kohlberg's 3 levels. His framework runs pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. There is no pre-moral level in his theory. Let's explore Kohlberg's conventional level of moral development, the stage where most teens and adults reason. At this level, morality moves outward from the self to the group. A person internalizes the expectations of family and society, judging actions by whether they win social approval and uphold the rules that hold society together. This level unfolds in 2 stages. In stage 3, the good interpersonal relationship stage, people reason from a desire to please others and earn approval. In stage 4, the law and order stage, they value upholding laws and duties to maintain social order, both driven by conformity rather than personal reward or punishment. Think of the moral ladder. Pre-conventional reasoning sits below, focused on the self, while post-conventional reasoning sits above, guided by universal principles. Conventional morality holds the middle rung, answering to others and to law. So remember, obeying the law because it's the law is conventional reasoning, not yet the principal post-conventional level that can judge a law itself unjust. Question 38. A theorist criticized Kohlberg for building his stages mainly on male participants and for treating abstract justice as the highest form of morality. She argued that many people reason instead from compassion, relationships, and responsibility to others. This alternative is known as an ethic of. Your options are A. Justice, B. Law and order, C. Car, D. Obedience. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Care. C is correct because Carol Gilligan proposed an ethic of care, grounding morality in relationships, compassion, and responsibility to others rather than impersonal principles. Her critique of Kohlberg's male-based justice-focused theory is exactly this care orientation. A is wrong because an ethic of justice, emphasizing abstract rights and fairness, is the orientation Gilligan attributed to Kohlberg and critiqued, not the alternative she offered. She contrasted care against justice. B is wrong because law and order is the name of Kohlberg's stage 4, not Gilligan's alternative framework. It belongs to the justice tradition she challenged. D is wrong because obedience refers to Kohlberg's stage 1, reasoning about avoiding punishment, not Gilligan's relationship-based morality. It is unrelated to an ethic of care. Psychologist Carol Gilligan challenged Kohlberg's theory of moral development, arguing it was built almost entirely on research with men and quietly crowned one moral voice as superior. Kohlberg studied mostly boys and men, then treated abstract justice reasoning as the peak of moral maturity. Gilligan pointed out that women's care-based reasoning was scored lower, not because it was less mature, but because the scoring system never learned to recognize it. Kohlberg's justice orientation weighs abstract principles, rules, and rights, treating everyone the same regardless of who is involved. Gilligan's care orientation instead asks who will be hurt, who needs help, and how to preserve relationships and honor responsibility to specific people. Faced with the very same dilemma, one person asks what the rules require and what is fair, while another asks who might get hurt and how to stay connected to the people involved. Neither voice is more mature than the other, they simply speak different moral languages. So whenever a scenario centers on preserving relationships and responding to others' needs, that's Gilligan's ethic of care answering Kohlberg's ethic of justice. Question 39. A child's teacher and mother text each other regularly about his progress, and the tension or calm at home clearly shapes how he behaves at school. In Bronfenbrenner's model, this connection between two settings the child is directly part of belongs to the. Your options are A. Microsystem, B. Mesosystem, C. Exosystem, D. Macrosystem. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. Mesosystem. B is correct because the mesosystem is made up of the connections between a person's microsystems, such as the link between home and school. Communication between the mother and teacher, two settings the child is in, is a mesosystem connection. A is wrong because the microsystem is a single immediate setting the child directly interacts with, such as the family or the classroom by itself. The scenario is about the link between two such settings, which is the mesosystem. C is wrong because the exosystem is a setting that affects the child indirectly and which the child is not part of, such as a parent's workplace. Both home and school here include the child, so the link is meso, not exo. D is wrong because the macrosystem is the overarching culture, values and laws surrounding everyone. A specific homeschool communication is far more immediate than the cultural blanket of the macrosystem. Yuri Bronfenbrenner reshaped developmental psychology by looking beyond the individual to the layered environment surrounding them, picturing nested rings of context that shape how a person grows. The microsystem is the immediate settings a person directly participates in, like family, classroom, and friends. The mesosystem is the connections between those settings, such as links between home and school. The exosystem is settings that affect the person, but that the person never directly enters, like a parent's workplace. Picture the model as rings encircling the developing child, from immediate settings at the center out to the wider culture beyond. The key test is whether the child is present in both settings. When a mother and teacher communicate, or home stress spills into the classroom, the child is present in both. So it's the mesosystem. When a mother's night shift disrupts life at home, the child never enters the workplace. So that's the exosystem. Remember the rule. If the child stands inside both linked settings, it's mesosystem. If the setting is one the child never enters, it's exosystem. Question 40. A researcher observes that a child belongs to the first generation raised entirely with smartphones, a sweeping technological change across generations that his parents did not experience growing up. In Bronfenbrenner's model, influences involving the passage of time and historical change belong to the. Your options are A. Microsystem, B. Mesosystem, C. Exosystem, D. Chronosystem. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Chronosystem. D is correct because the chronosystem is Bronfenbrenner's dimension of time, covering historical events and changes in the person and environment across the lifespan and across generations. Being part of the first smartphone native generation is a chronosystem influence. A is wrong because the microsystem is an immediate setting the child directly interacts with, such as family or classroom. Generational technological change is not a single immediate setting. B is wrong because the mesosystem is the set of connections between the child's immediate settings. A sweeping change over historical time is not a link between two settings. C is wrong because the exosystem is a setting that affects the child indirectly, such as a parent's workplace. A generational shift over time concerns the time dimension, not an indirect setting. Bronfenbrenner's model has 4 settings layers, but the outermost ring is different. It's not a place, it's time itself. This is the chronosystem. The chronosystem covers 2 kinds of change: personal life transitions like starting school, divorce, or aging, and historical shifts like wars, economic depressions, and technological revolutions that reshape an entire generation. The same divorce affects a toddler very differently than it affects a teenager, showing that timing itself shapes how an event is experienced. Picture 4 nested rings representing settings: microsystem, mesosystem, exosystem, and macrosystem, with the chronosystem wrapped around all of them as the dimension of time and history. A child who grows up with smartphones from birth is shaped by a historical chronosystem influence that never existed for their parents. When a question centers on timing, history, or generational change rather than a setting, it's pointing to the chronosystem. Listen for signal words like time and history, generational change, life transitions, and shifts across the lifespan. Question 41. A genetics instructor explains that most human cells contain 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs, that 22 of these pairs are autosomes, and that one pair determines biological sex. Which statement about the sex chromosomes is correct? Your options are: A. The mother's egg determines the child's sex by contributing an X or a Y. B. Females are XY and males are XX. C. The father's sperm determines the child's sex by contributing an X or a Y. D. All 23 pairs are autosomes. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is C. The father's sperm determines the child's sex by contributing an X or a Y. C is correct because the mother always contributes an X. So the father's sperm, carrying either an X or a Y, determines the child's sex. An X from the father yields a female and a Y yields a male. A is wrong because the mother's egg always carries an X and therefore cannot determine sex on its own. It is the father's contribution of an X or a Y that decides sex. B is wrong because the patterns are reversed. Females are XX and males are XY, not the other way around. This option states the combinations backward. D is wrong because only 22 of the 23 pairs are autosomes. The 23rd pair is the sex chromosomes. Saying all 23 pairs are autosomes ignores the sex pair. Every trait begins with the gene, the basic unit of inheritance, and genes are organized along chromosomes packed inside the cell's nucleus. Genes carry the instructions for building proteins, which construct and run the body's cells, and humans have an estimated 20,500 genes threaded along chromosomes made of DNA. Human cells contain 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. 22 are autosomes carrying general genetic instructions, while the 23rd pair is the sex chromosomes that determine biological sex. A female has 2 matching X chromosomes, while a male has 1 X and 1 shorter Y. Since the mother's egg always contributes an X, it's the father's sperm, carrying either an X or a Y, that determines the child's sex. Remember the anchors: 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs, 22 autosome pairs and 1 sex pair, and it's always the father's sperm that decides whether a child is female or male. Question 42. One kind of cell division copies all the chromosomes and splits into 2 identical body cells, each keeping the full 46 chromosomes. Which process is this, and what is the fertilized cell called when a sperm and an egg later unite? Your options are: A. Mitosis, the zygote. B. Meiosis, the zygote. C. Mitosis, the gamete. D. Meiosis, the blastocyst. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Mitosis, the zygote. A is correct because mitosis produces 2 identical body cells, each with the full set of 46 chromosomes, which matches the described division. When a sperm and an egg unite at fertilization, the single new cell formed is the zygote, with 46 chromosomes restored. B is wrong because meiosis does not make identical body cells. it divides twice to make gametes with 23 chromosomes each. The first part of this option misidentifies the process, even though the zygote is correct. C is wrong because although mitosis is the correct process, a gamete is a sperm or an egg with 23 chromosomes, not the cell formed when they unite. The fertilized cell is the zygote, not a gamete. D is wrong because meiosis is the wrong process for making identical 46 chromosome body cells, and a blastocyst is a later ball of about 100 cells, not the single fertilized cell. Both parts of this option are incorrect. The body uses two very different kinds of cell division, and the chromosome count each one produces is the key to keeping them straight. Mitosis divides once and produces two identical body cells, each with the full 46 chromosomes. Meiosis divides twice and produces 4 gametes, each carrying only 23 chromosomes. In mitosis, a cell copies its chromosomes once and splits once, so each of the two daughter cells keeps the full count of 46. In meiosis, the cell divides twice, halving the chromosome number down to 23 in each of the 4 resulting cells. At fertilization, a sperm carrying 23 chromosomes unites with an ovum carrying 23, restoring the full 46 in the zygote, the fertilized cell holding the complete genetic blueprint of a new individual. Whenever a scenario describes identical full-count body cells, think mitosis. Whenever it describes half-count sex cells, think meiosis. Question 43. 2 healthy parents, neither of whom has cystic fibrosis, have a child born with this recessive disorder. The best explanation is that each parent. Your options are: A. Has the disorder but shows no symptoms. B. Contributed an extra chromosome 21. C. Passed on a dominant disease gene. D. Is a carrier of one recessive gene for the disorder. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is D. Is a carrier of one recessive gene for the disorder. D is correct because a recessive disorder appears only when a child inherits the recessive gene from both parents. 2 healthy parents who each carry one recessive gene are carriers. They are symptom-free but can pass the gene on, so a child can inherit both copies. A is wrong because a carrier does not have the disorder. Carrying one recessive gene leaves a person healthy. The parents are not symptom-free cases of the disease, but carriers of a single copy. B is wrong because an extra chromosome 21 causes Down syndrome, a chromosomal abnormality, not a recessive single-gene disorder like cystic fibrosis. The mechanisms are entirely different. C is wrong because a dominant disease gene would express in a parent who carried even one copy, so a parent passing it on would typically show the disorder. Cystic fibrosis is recessive, requiring 2 copies in the child. To understand inherited diseases, we need 2 key term pairs: genotype versus phenotype and dominant versus recessive. Genotype is the full genetic blueprint a person inherits, while phenotype is the traits actually expressed. A dominant gene shows itself even with just one copy, but a recessive gene only shows itself when both copies match. When both parents carry one recessive gene hidden behind a normal dominant copy, they appear healthy, but each can pass the recessive gene to their child. If a child inherits the recessive copy from both parents, the disorder appears seemingly out of nowhere. Recessive disorders like cystic fibrosis need 2 copies of the faulty gene, letting them hide silently in healthy carriers for generations. Dominant disorders need only 1 copy, so they usually show up directly in an affected parent. So whenever 2 unaffected parents have an affected child, the pattern points to a recessive disorder carried silently by both parents. Question 44. A certain disorder appears far more often in a family's sons than its daughters, and the unaffected daughters can still have affected sons of their own. Knowing that males have only one X chromosome, this pattern is best explained as: your options are A. An autosomal dominant disorder, B. X-linked recessive inheritance, C. A trisomy of chromosome 21, D. Incomplete dominance. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. X-linked recessive inheritance. B is correct because in X-linked recessive inheritance, the defective gene sits on the X chromosome. Males have only one X, so a single recessive copy is expressed, while females usually have a second X that masks it and makes them carriers. This is why such disorders strike sons far more than daughters and pass through unaffected female carriers. A is wrong because an autosomal dominant disorder would affect sons and daughters about equally and would usually show in an affected parent. The strong male bias here points to the X chromosome, not an autosome. C is wrong because a trisomy of chromosome 21 causes Down syndrome and does not follow this carrier-to-son pattern. It is a chromosomal abnormality, not an X-linked gene. D is wrong because incomplete dominance is a blending of two gene versions, such as in sickle cell trait, not a sex-biased inheritance pattern. It does not explain why sons are affected far more than daughters. Some genetic disorders strike males far more often than females, and the reason lies in sex-linked inheritance, where the responsible gene sits on the X chromosome. A female has two X chromosomes, while a male has only one X and one Y. That single asymmetry, two X's versus one, is the entire reason the sexes face different odds for these recessive conditions. In a female, a normal copy on her second X usually masks a recessive disease gene, so she becomes an unaffected carrier. A male has no second X to mask it, so a single recessive gene on his lone X is expressed and he develops the disorder. This mechanism creates a recognizable family pattern. The disorder appears mainly in sons, while daughters are unaffected carriers who can pass the gene to their own sons. Classic examples include hemophilia, red-green color blindness, and male pattern baldness. So whenever a disorder concentrates in sons and is carried silently by unaffected daughters, it points to X-linked recessive inheritance because a male single X has no partner to override a recessive gene. Question 45. A male newborn is found to have an extra X chromosome, giving him an XXY pattern. In adolescence, he shows small test, some breast development, and low testosterone. This chromosomal condition is... Your options are A. Turner syndrome, B. Down syndrome, C. Klinefelter syndrome, D. Fragile X syndrome. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is C. Klinefelter syndrome. C is correct because Klinefelter syndrome is an XXY pattern. An extra X in a male, the Y still triggers male genitalia, but the extra X inhibits development, leading to small testes, breast development, and low testosterone. The XXY detail with these features is decisive. A is wrong because Turner syndrome is an XO pattern in a female, missing all or part of one X, with underdeveloped ovaries and no menstruation. It does not describe a male with an extra X. B is wrong because Down syndrome is caused by 3 copies of chromosome 21, not an extra sex chromosome. Its features are intellectual disability and distinctive facial traits, not the pattern described. D is wrong because Fragile X syndrome results from a problem making a protein the brain needs, causing learning and behavioral difficulties. It is not an XXY pattern with these physical features. Not every genetic condition traces back to a single broken gene. Some arise instead from having too many or too few whole chromosomes. Single gene disorders involve a mistake in one gene, while chromosomal abnormalities involve an error in the number of entire chromosomes. Several well-known conditions fall into the second category, each with its own signature pattern. Down syndrome, the most familiar case, results from trisomy 21, 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of 2. This extra chromosome produces the classic features: intellectual disability, short fingers and toes, skin folds over the eyes, and a protruding tongue. Klinefelter syndrome affects males with an extra X, giving an XXY pattern along with small testes and low testosterone. Turner syndrome affects females missing an X, leaving a single X and undeveloped ovaries. Fragile X syndrome, caused by a protein deficiency, is a leading inherited cause of intellectual disability. Whenever a question describes an extra or missing chromosome, the pattern gives away the diagnosis: trisomy 21 for Down syndrome, an extra X for Klinefelter, and a missing X for Turner. Question 46. A naturally cheerful, smiley infant is cooed at, played with, and talked to more by nearly every adult he meets, because his sunny temperament draws those reactions out of people. This best illustrates which type of genotype-environment correlation. Your options are A. Evocative, B. Passive, C. Active, D. Reactive. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Evocative? A is correct because an evocative genotype-environment correlation occurs when a child's inherited traits draw out, or evoke, reactions from the social environment. The infant's cheerful temperament pulling more interaction from adults is the textbook evocative example. B is wrong because A, passive correlation, occurs when parents pass on both the genes and a matching environment to a child too young to choose. Here, the wider social world is reacting to the baby's trait rather than parents supplying a setting. C is wrong because an active correlation, or niche picking, occurs when a person seeks out environments that fit their genes, which requires independence a young infant lacks. The baby is not choosing his surroundings, others are responding to him. D is wrong because reactive is not one of the 3 named genotype-environment correlations, which are passive, evocative, and active. It is a distractor term, not a category in the framework. Genes don't just shape who we are, they also help shape the environments we experience. This link between genotype and environment comes in 3 distinct types, distinguished by one key question: who is doing the acting? Passive correlation happens when parents supply both the genes and the matching environment to a child too young to choose. Evocative correlation happens when a child's inherited traits draw out particular reactions from other people. Active correlation, or niche picking, happens when a person independently seeks out environments that fit their genetic tendencies. Consider infant temperament. A cheerful, smiley baby evokes cooing and playful interaction from nearly every adult, while a fussy, irritable baby evokes more strained handling. The environment is reacting to something the child brings. That's the evocative correlation. The deciding cue is always who acts. Passive means parents provide both genes and setting. Evocative means the child's traits pull responses from others. Active means the person seeks out a fitting environment. A baby's pleasant temperament causing adults to respond warmly is a textbook evocative correlation. The child's traits are shaping the environment's response. Question 47. Researchers note that a pair of identical twins who share the same DNA increasingly differ in which genes are switched on and off as they grow older and accumulate different experiences such as diet and stress. The study of these heritable changes in gene expression that do not alter the DNA sequence itself is called. Your options are A. Niche picking, B. Incomplete dominance, C. Natural selection, D. Epigenetics. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is D, epigenetics. D is correct because epigenetics studies modifications that change gene expression, switching genes on or off, without changing the underlying DNA sequence, and these changes can be passed on when cells divide. Identical twins diverging in gene expression as their experiences differ is the course's flagship epigenetic example. A is wrong because niche picking is another name for the active genotype-environment correlation, in which a person seeks out fitting environments. It is not about switching genes on and off. B is wrong because incomplete dominance is a pattern in which a dominant gene only partially masks a recessive one, blending traits. It does not describe environmentally driven changes in gene expression. C is wrong because natural selection is the evolutionary process by which heritable traits that aid survival become more common over generations. It is not the study of gene expression changing within a person's lifetime. For most of genetics history, DNA was treated as a fixed blueprint. Epigenetics reveals a hidden layer of control that changes that picture. Epigenetics is the study of gene expression, whether genes are switched on or off, without any change to the underlying DNA sequence. These expression changes can even be passed on when cells divide. Environmental signals help decide which genes get expressed. Nutrition, stress, and exposure to toxins or teratogens can all alter gene expression epigenetically. Identical twins start with the same DNA sequence, yet as they age, their gene expression patterns diverge. Different diets, stresses, and exposures switch different genes on and off. So two people with identical code end up expressed differently. Remember the key contrast. A mutation rewrites the DNA code itself, while epigenetics only changes which genes are expressed, leaving the sequence intact. Question 48. A team wants to track how the same group of people's personality traits actually change from age 25 to age 65 by studying those same individuals repeatedly over 4 decades. Which research design are they using? Your options are A. Cross-sectional, B. Longitudinal, C. Correlational, D. Experimental. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is B. Longitudinal. B is correct because a longitudinal design follows the same individuals over an extended period, which reveals genuine change within people. Studying the same group repeatedly from age 25 to 65 is the defining feature of a longitudinal study. A is wrong because a cross-sectional design compares different age groups at a single point in time, not the same people over time. It would compare separate 25-year-olds and 65-year-olds at once, confounding age with cohort. C is wrong because correlational research measures whether two variables change together, but does not by itself involve following people across time. The defining feature here is repeated study of the same individuals, which names a longitudinal design. D is wrong because an experiment randomly assigns people to conditions and manipulates a variable to establish cause and effect. The team is observing natural change over time, not manipulating anything. Developmental scientists rely on 2 core research designs to study age-related change: the longitudinal design and the cross-sectional design. A longitudinal design follows the same people repeatedly over years. A cross-sectional design compares different age groups at one moment, and the cohort problem is the vulnerability that arises when age and generation become tangled together. Picture one generation tracked across their lifespan, the same 25-year-olds measured again at 40 and again at 65, so that any differences reflect true aging within that single cohort. Longitudinal studies capture real within-person change but take decades and lose participants to dropout, while cross-sectional studies are fast and inexpensive but confound age differences with cohort or generational. Differences. Remember the trade-off. Longitudinal designs follow one group across years to reveal genuine change, while cross-sectional designs compare groups in a single snapshot for speed at the cost of confounding age with cohort. Question 49. A study finds that children who spend more hours on screens tend to have more behavior problems. A careful researcher cautions that this finding alone cannot prove screen time causes the behavior problems. The best reason for this caution is that your options are: A. The sample was too small to matter. B. A correlation always means there is no real relationship. C. A correlation cannot establish causation since a third variable may explain both. D. Only longitudinal studies can ever find correlations. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is C. A correlation cannot establish causation since a third variable may explain both. C is correct because a correlation shows that two variables change together but cannot prove one causes the other, because a third variable might drive both. Only a true experiment with random assignment can establish cause and effect, which is why the researcher is cautious. A is wrong because the caution about causation holds regardless of sample size. Even a very large correlational sample cannot prove cause and effect. Sample size is not the reason a correlation fails to show causation. B is wrong because a correlation does indicate a real statistical relationship. It simply cannot tell you the direction of cause. Saying it means no relationship misstates what a correlation is. D is wrong because correlations can be found in many designs, including cross-sectional ones, not only longitudinal studies. This option misdescribes how correlations are obtained. Correlation does not equal causation, one of the most important lessons in research methods, and one of the most frequently ignored in everyday thinking. A correlation simply means two variables tend to change together, positive when they rise and fall together, negative when one rises as the other falls. Either way, correlation only describes a relationship. It never proves what's causing it. Consider children who spend more hours on screens and also show more behavior problems. It's tempting to blame the screens, but a hidden third variable, like a chaotic home environment, could independently drive both, with no direct causal link between them at all. Only a true experiment can establish cause and effect. Researchers randomly assign participants to conditions, manipulate one variable, and hold everything else constant, spreading any third variables evenly across groups so causation can be confidently inferred. Many developmental questions, like the effects of abuse or prenatal toxins, can't ethically be tested experimentally, so researchers rely on correlational data. That's why findings are reported as links or associations, not proven causes. Only random assignment can rule out a hidden third variable. Question 50. Moments after a baby is born, a nurse rates the newborn's activity, pulse, grimace, appearance, and respiration, scoring each from 0 to 2, and then repeats the rating a few minutes later. Which assessment is the nurse using? Your options are the APGAR, B, the Bailey Scales of Infant Development, C, an IQ test, D, the Body Mass Index. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A, the APGAR. A is correct because the APGAR scores 5 newborn signs: activity, pulse, grimace, appearance, and respiration, each from 0 to 2, and is taken at 1 and 5 minutes after birth. The 5 signs scored just after delivery identify it as the APGAR. B is wrong because the Bailey scales assess cognition, language, social emotional, motor, and adaptive behavior across infancy and toddlerhood to flag delays, not the 5 vital signs at birth. They are given over the first years, not in the delivery room. C is wrong because an IQ test measures intelligence from school age onward with a mean of 100 and is not administered to a newborn moments after birth. It does not score vital signs. D is wrong because the body mass index relates height to weight to screen for overweight or obesity. It is unrelated to scoring a newborn's vital signs right after delivery. Developmental science relies on standardized assessments, tools given the same way every time so results can be compared across people and across time. A handful of these recur throughout the lifespan, each tied to a specific domain and a specific moment. The earliest assessment is the APGAR, a quick physical snapshot taken in the first minutes of life. It rates 5 signs: activity, pulse, grimace, appearance, and respiration, each scored 0 to 2, at 1 minute and again at 5 minutes, with a total of 5 or below signaling concern. The neonatal behavioral assessment scale checks a newborn's motor tone and stress responses in the first weeks, while the Bailey scales of infant development extend the picture across infancy, screening 5 domains: cognition, language, social-emotional, motor, and adaptive behavior to flag delays early. Later assessments track later life. Body mass index compares height and weight. IQ measures intelligence around a mean of 100, with 130 marking giftedness and 70 marking intellectual disability, and blood glucose screens adults for prediabetes and diabetes risk. Remember the pairing. The APGAR is the immediate newborn check. The Bailey scales screen infant development for delays. And IQ measures intelligence from school age onward. So a scenario about a baby's vital signs moments after birth always points to the APGAR. And that's a wrap on today's Domain 1 question review. If you'd like more practice on everything we just went over, check out our website. You'll find the link right in the description below. There, you'll discover hundreds of free practice questions along with complete study guides all ready and waiting for you whenever you need them. Subscribe to catch the next part, and good luck on your exam.